The key, I would say, for Indian companies is to ask the question, where is Indian demand? Because of the characteristics of the market, where is it? Is it particularly demanding, particularly sophisticated, in a way that if you can serve that, you will be able to serve demand around the world who would have similar interests, but maybe not as kind of picky and demanding.
We somehow have taught in many of our business schools and in our economies that winning or doing well means you have to beat somebody else. Do you think there is a case for relooking the economics that is taught fundamentally in our schools in the light of some of the arguments that?
No, I don't think we need. I don't think we need to do that, because I mean, I think Roger used the right term a little while ago, which is win-win. You know, I think the way to win economically, the way to win geopolitically, and the way to win personally is to identify win-wins and try to develop them.
I was privileged to have this fascinating conversation with two global thought leaders. Roger Martin, who's one of the world's leading experts, first in areas like design thinking and then in terms of strategy, where he's worked with A.G. Lafley at Procter & Gamble. And he's recently written a book called More is Not Better, which talks about some of the dangers of adopting a machine model of efficiency and taking it to economic growth. The second person in this conversation was Jeff Garrett. Now, Jeff was the former dean of the Wharton School. He's currently dean of the USC Marshall School of Business. And Jeff is a noted LinkedIn influencer and thinker. And Jeff's areas are, he writes a lot about the global economy, the future of the global economy. He also writes about leadership. Now, Jeff is also, of course, a member of the BITSoM Governing Council. The conversation spanned a lot of areas. It's a really fascinating conversation. It first started off by talking about what is wrong with democratic capitalism. And a lot of it focused on the pandemic and the US and what has happened in the US economy initially. One of the points that got repeatedly made is that very often the pandemic accelerated fault lines or trends that were already there. From these fault lines and trends, we moved on to what COVID will do to the economy. And we talked about two forces post-COVID. One is we talked about globalization and we talked about technology. There seemed to be broad agreement that there is a possibility of some de-globalization. That is the pace of globalization slowing, but the pace of technology continuing. And then we looked at what this kind of disruption means for people who are either looking at the economy, at policy level, or looking at people who are heading companies. One of the themes that came about was talking about systems and designing systems for efficiency versus designing systems for resilience. We took that a little bit further and we were looking at implications for Indian companies and what will it take to create the next Google or Microsoft out of India. A lot of interesting advice. And one of the things I took away there is this concept of the sophisticated customer. That if you can find out an area where your country has customers who are sophisticated in their needs, and that sophistication is relevant for a large population across the world, then your country can become a source of global innovation. Very, very interesting in terms of a perspective. We talked a bit about the leader of tomorrow and what the leader of tomorrow needs to do in terms of thinking differently. Jeff talked about leaders thinking win-win, solutions for a better planet as they are getting into industry. He talked about social consciousness and talked about humility, adaptability, and the willingness to listen. In fact, one of the ideas that he came up with is the idea of the leader as explainer in chief. I then asked Roger towards the end of the conversation to talk about his advice to the business school teachers of tomorrow. And he quoted Aristotle, he talked about philosophy, but two or three big points there. He talked about data and the limitations of even huge masses of data when it comes to the future. So the difference between structured decisions and unstructured decisions. and the limitations of data when you are looking at the future and the decisions that you're looking at are unstructured. And he quoted Aristotle to go on and say, to moving from cause and effect to the teacher of tomorrow and the researcher of tomorrow becoming the cause of the effect that they wanted to see in the world. We closed this conversation talking about, again, democratic capitalism and saying, if the US has not got it right, which are the countries which they think have got it right? And they seem to agree on Scandinavia. And one of the takeaways is Roger said Sweden has smart taxation and the US has what we called stupid taxation. It was a fascinating conversation. It covers a whole range, ranging from the economy to industry, to what Indian companies should be doing, to why India and Indonesia are markets the world will look for, to advice for the leader of tomorrow, to advice for the teacher of tomorrow. I enjoyed being a part of this conversation. I'm sure you're going to enjoy listening to this conversation.
So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege for me to be speaking to two of the foremost management thinkers in the world. We have Professor Roger Martin, whose book, More is Not Less, is the latest in a long string of books where he has very provocative and original ideas, and he's regarded as one of the leading thinkers in various forums across the world. We have with us Professor Geoffrey Garrett, who was the former dean of the Wharton School and is currently the dean of the USC Marshall School of Business. Incidentally, he is also a member of BITSoM Governing Council and somebody I've worked with. Both of them are very well-known and sought-after speakers, and it is a privilege for me to be speaking to both of them here today. So let me start with my first question, which is directed to Roger. Roger, in your latest book, and this book was released before the pandemic, and even then you had identified certain things that were wrong with the democratic capitalist model. And specifically, you talked about the economy as a complex adaptive system and the perils of treating the economy as a machine or a machine model where one maximizes efficiency in the parts. What do you think the pandemic has done to expose those weaknesses? How do you see those weaknesses emerging in the context of the pandemic?
Sure. Well, I mean, I wrote in the book about this shift, and I was focusing on the US economy, but I think this applies more broadly, from an economy in which everybody moved forward, and especially the middle class over time moved forward economically, to a world in which the tail of the distribution, the more well-off tail, was doing awesomely well. In fact, better than it's ever done in the history of the US economy, while the middle income families are stagnating and doing arguably the worst that they have ever done in America. And I think the pandemic has kind of shone a lot of light on that discrepancy. And in that economy pre-pandemic, a whole class of workers were kind of considered kind of disposable. Who cared who you got? Who cared what wages you paid them? Who cared if you trained them or not? And who cared how precarious their employment was, right? And then in the pandemic, we called them something new: essential. These were essential workers who are keeping the economy going. And a bunch of those essential workers, I think, have woken up and said, wait a minute, we were treated as utterly disposable. I mean, seriously, utterly disposable, with precarious hours, precarious wages, precarious employment, kind of no training, no safety net for us. And now we're essential. Oh, and then after the COVID is over, I guess we'll be going back to disposable. So I think there's a real challenge now coming for the economy to react now to what we learned in the pandemic that said, gee, they aren't disposable. They are essential. They needed to be treated with respect before the pandemic. Then we got an object lesson. Let's make sure we treat them with the respect they deserve kind of as we come out of the pandemic. So I think that, to me, that's one of the very biggest things that's come out of it. And there's, I think, just widespread dissatisfaction in people quitting their jobs. And I think it's because they realized that they were not being treated in a fashion that's consistent with their inherent worth as a human being.
Yeah, and can I just jump in there? I think you're exactly right, Roger, and maybe, Ranjan, this is a theme for our whole conversation, but my overall take on the pandemic is it's accelerating trends that were already there. And this is certainly one of them. And Roger, I think you spoke very eloquently about the sort of bottom end, the tail of the distribution, but what about the other tail? You know, I think when we look at the crisis of capitalism, it really is, the biggest issue is inequality. And you ask the question, you know, why is inequality so much worse today? And my answer is that there are the two things that are driving the world today are vertically scalable, and they're the first vertically scalable things in history, and they are finance and technology, right? You can, to go from an app with a million users to 1 billion users requires nothing. It just requires people to click on the app. To do an investment at $1 million is no different than doing an investment at $1 billion. You're just going to make more money. So I think that, you know, there's this, if we go back in time, 1980s, 1990s, you know, that people really believed in trickle down or all a rising tide lifts all boats. And what we've seen instead in the last 20 years, I think, what are the qualities of vertical scalability? One is you can get vertically rich overnight. Look at these 20-something billionaires in the crypto space. But the second thing is you need just many fewer people to do it. And so we've got this ironically unbelievably productive and unbelievably remunerated portion of the economy, but it is so tiny today. Yeah. And I don't think that was the truth, right? When Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were talking about the wonders of the market in the 1980s, you know, they sold it to middle-class people as saying, you're going to benefit too. And I think that, you know, that sale is just impossible to make these days.
Yeah. The other thing, I think we're in violent agreement, Jeff. But the other piece of the puzzle that I would add is that in the 70s, so something very fundamental happened to the economy in the 70s before all this sort of vertical scalability that you talked about, that I think made the results of the vertical scalability different than they would have otherwise been. And that was the rise of talent as a factor of production, right? So in the good old days, we would have said the factors of production are labor, capital, and raw materials. You put those three things together and you get yourself a business, right? And for many years, there was a battle between capital and labor, right? Before 1935 in the US, capital was beating down labor. Then the National Labor Relations Board was created and the National Labor Relations Act, and then unionism rose, and the power of unions to take care of their workers kind of rose through the 60s. And then later on, capital sort of battled back, but that was sort of the battle. Capital versus labor, and capital tended to own raw materials. So it went out and used its capital to buy raw materials. But in the 70s, what emerged was this separate factor, which was talent. So human beings separated into labor that was more generic and labor that was extremely specialized, right? And it happened first in sports, when baseball players got free agency in 1975. It happened in movies when in Raiders of the Lost Ark, George Lucas went into Paramount and said, I want 50% of pre-tax or pre-overhead pre-marketing profits of the movie. And Barry Diller and Michael Eisner said, oh, and how much are you going to pay for that? And he said, $0. I'm going to make the movie with you. And that's when the 2 and 20 formula in private equity kind of arose. That's when Jensen and Michael Jensen and Bill Mechnig wrote their 1976 famous article on agency theory, and we started tying executive compensation to stock performance. all of those things in the 70s, in the decade of the 70s. So actually before Reagan and Thatcher, was this awakening of a factor of production that was talent. Now, it had always been around, but talent started extracting more and more. And I think what that then seamlessly kind of worked into is the environment you talked about, Jeff, which is then when we've got this technology and its ability for vertical scaling, we had already accepted that you had to have talent, and capital started to say, I'll give talent whatever they want, right? Because without the talent, I can't earn my money. So venture capitalists would say, here, go take it. And sure, you can have total control of the company. You can make kind of billions, no problem. Just take me along for the ride. Whereas prior to 1980, capital was, we're in charge here. This is what we will pay you. You will work for us. And that era is gone. And that tail of the distribution, that tiny little tail that you're referring to, Jeff, in my view, is talent, which knows it's totally in charge. Capital is completely cowed. And the politicians kind of don't quite know what to do because, right, we had this political alignment in the US where the Democrats were behind a factor of production called labor, and the Republicans were behind the factor of production called capital. And now you've got this weird world in which that human dimension has split, and the political parties actually don't know who to protect and who to take care of.
Well, and of course, in the UK and the US, that's flipped politics, where you have Boris Johnson and Donald Trump as the defenders of the people who are losing from the system. But, yes. I think, Roger, starting the 70s really interesting, because if I then fast forward, I grew up intellectually in the 1980s. And if I think about that 4-decade sweep, the two biggest forces in the world have been globalization and technology. And they have empowered that talent that you were talking about, right? And so I think, Ranjan, going forward, the question is, can we put the genie back in the bottle where globalization and technology are concerned? I think we're seeing evidence that you can do it with respect to globalization. I don't want us to throw the baby out with the bathwater there, but I think we are in a deglobalizing era. But I don't see how to put the tech genie back in the bottle. There's going to be a lot of efforts to regulate Facebook and Google and then all the crypto industry in the next several years. I suspect that's going to be really difficult, really clunky, have some unintended consequences. But the task for government, even if you're trying to quote unquote manage the factors of production, I think is just so much more difficult than it was in the era you were talking about, Roger.
I think you're right. Though I think you have to sort of take this longer term perspective and ask kind of what were people saying about Teddy Roosevelt and trust busting, right? There was a lot of like, whoa, this is sort of intervention of an unprecedented kind of nature into the functioning of business. But this was in the early 1900s. This was a response to trusts, buying up and taking control of oil and gas, kind of sugar, tobacco, all sorts of things, and so I do, and was trust busting, clunky and a blunt instrument, yes, but I think we're in an era where we're going to see more of that. And I agree, and I couldn't agree with you more on globalization. I think we will see peak globalization having happened, kind of somewhere in the 2010, give or take a few years range. And I think we're going to be in a long period, at least 20, 30, maybe 50 years of deglobalization, which I know you've talked and written about. I'm 100% in agreement that is the direction we're going. But I think there's going to be much more handcuffing of the monopolists, because they're doing what John D. Rockefeller did before, right? All these companies have internal memos floating around about kill zones, right? Here's our core business, and here are the kill zones around that core business, and if anybody gets into them, we will kill them, right?
So, that throws up actually potentially fascinating discussion, and I'm just going to orient this a bit, because a majority of the people who are listening in are Indian leaders and corporate leaders, many of whom are actually looking to take their businesses global or make their businesses more global. So if I were to take these two forces, Jeff, that you've talked about, technology and globalization, and you're saying we could have deglobalization, but kind of the impact of technology across the globe is here to stay and may get stronger. How do you see these two forces playing out in a post-COVID world over the next, let's say, 5 years? And if you had any advice to offer to CEOs of potentially global corporations, what would that be? So these are two questions actually, but maybe Jeff, you could take it first, and then Roger, you could pick it up.
So if deglobalization is the big trend, the first wave of it obviously is the decoupling of the US and China, that is going to have enormous impact both on the US and on China. But I think it's going to have enormous impact on the rest of the world too. And it's just going to create a lot of opportunity in the rest of the world. So, if we just focus on the tech sector, for example, I think the amount of investment going into India and Indonesia, to use two obvious cases at the moment, is enormous. Why? You've got emerging middle-class markets, young populations, lots of people becoming middle-class consumers, and global companies figure out that, boy, that's where the new markets are going to be. We could use lots of examples, but let's stay in India for a second. Alibaba and Amazon want to compete in India. They're competing against each other, but they're also competing for the Indian market. And what they're saying today is that we need Indian partners to do it, which is looking great for Mukesh Ambani and Reliance and some other Indian companies. So, if I was trying to advise the Indian government on how to do this, it would be to, on the one hand, to understand that liberalizing the Indian economy makes it really attractive to global players. But on the other hand, can we structure that in a way that will be good for India? Which I think in the first instance probably means good for Indian companies. Not easy to do, but I do think, just ending where I started, the leading edge of deglobalization is the decoupling of the US and China. That just creates lots of opportunities for other players on the global stage who were frozen out because of the tightness of the connections between China and India in the last 20 years.
No.
Right. So just building on that, Roger, India has typically often looked at the US as its model economy, right? As the economy to follow. Yeah. So what do you think India should learn from the US, and what do you think we should not learn from the US?
Well, so I love the Indian economy and have many friends. Nandan Nilekani is a good friend. Chandra Ramatrai before him. What I would say to my friends is that in this modern world, if you're Infosys or TCS, although Chandra is now Tata and Sons, but if you were those companies, you really have to think about being like Toyota, being like Japan, right? So Toyota and the Japanese companies did get their start by having significantly lower cost labor, right? And they exported on the back of that lower cost labor. And that is actually, what TCS and Infosys are doing. They're writing apps for American companies using cheaper Indian labor than would be the labor in the US. But is that the case with Toyota or Japan now? No, labor rates are higher in Japan than they are, and they had to make sure they evolved to competing in a way that could enable them to continue winning without a labor cost advantage, and they had to start investing more in manufacturing, et cetera, in America. So I would say that to the big Indian tech companies is that they're going to have to figure out right? One, how to make sure they're investing in kind of American, if they're serving the American market, American labor, which they're doing, but also raising they have to be leading in the effort to get the Indian wage levels up, right, to a level where they're forced to compete in more sophisticated ways, right? So Toyota competes on QRD, quality, reliability, durability, kind of all of those things. It does not compete on the basis of we have cheap labor and we can build you a cheaper car. I think both Infosys, TCS, and the other great Indian outsourcing companies are heading in that direction. But I would be saying to them they need to push the pace as fast as possible to avoid a globalization backlash that says, sorry, we're going to put it happened in cars, right? We're going to put voluntary restraints on you. Like, imagine that if the U.S. government came to Infosys and TCS and said, we're putting voluntary restraints on how big your business can be in the U.S. You're at whatever, 30 billion in the U.S. now, 32. That's your limit. It would be, right? It would be disastrously bad.
Can I jump in there, Roger? I mean,
yeah, sure.
So that model, the Japan model, there are obviously very important lessons to learn there, but India has an advantage that Japan did not, which is a rising middle-class domestic market that is just looks like the future, right? I mean, the benefit of having a young population that's also getting richer is incredible for domestic firms. And, TCS, Infosys, the kind of outsourcing model of Indian technology, I think, is being increasingly replaced now by the online to offline companies that are all about using technology to service domestic consumers in India, and that's a great opportunity. But I think there is a question whether the global players who do that really well, Amazon, Alibaba, Tencent, whether they come in and try to dominate the Indian market, or whether it's more homegrown companies, Flipkart, et cetera, that are going to be the big players. And, that's where I think government can play an important role. One thing that China did smartly, I think, was to say to foreign players, you can enter our market, but you can only enter in JVs with our companies, because that's going to be soft tech transfer. It's going to help us develop our own domestic firms. So I think I agree with you that the global market's the way to go, but India, like Indonesia, does have this advantage of a young population that's getting richer and wants to consume a lot, and that gives, I think, a bit of an advantage to domestic firms.
No, I agree, Jeff. Though what I would say is that you're describing Japan during the period that these auto giants, for example, kind of emerged, right? Coming out of World War II, the devastation of World War II, there was rapid economic growth, a rising middle class. But you are right. Now Japan is shrinking, and inevitably there is no way it's not going to shrink. That domestic market shrinking. But I think it actually reinforces your point, which is the same formula that worked there can work in India. The tricky thing for me is just on the labor market. I mean, just India has just got, of course, so many people to have those wages rise to cause them to be a sophisticated economy with relatively high labor rates that must compete on more sophisticated basis. Japan, that was easier. It didn't have this vast array of very low paid workers to rise. China kind of similarly has that challenge, but in China there's this flood of workers to the coastal areas, and the incomes are rising so fast there. So I think there's all sorts of opportunity. As I say, I love the Indian economy, and while I was dean every year for the 15 years, I would go to India, and I think it's got huge potential, but the global forces are going to be trickier for India in the next 10 years than they've been in the past 10 years, for example.
So, coming back to technology, Roger, just picking up on this, and here, I am somebody who has studied in the US, has chosen to come back to India. And one of the questions we keep asking ourselves is, many of the Googles and the Microsofts are powered by some of our talent, right? I mean, not entirely, but definitely a significant contribution. So what would it take for the next Google or Microsoft to be from India? I just welcome your take, and Jeff, you're very close to the center of the action there. So maybe you want to come in on this. Is it something that you think will not happen? Are there conditions for it to happen? Because clearly the talent is there, right? I mean,
yeah, it's figuring out in what area Indian demand is highly sophisticated, right? And so this is Mike Porter, 1990, right? The competitive advantage of nations. He had the brilliant observation that countries export their national passion. And kind of why? It's because they have the most picky and demanding customers at home. So if you can make shoes for Milanese women, Northern Italian women, everybody else in the world is dead simple to make shoes for, because they're not going to be as picky and demanding as Northern Italian kind of women. Or if you can sell chocolate to Swiss people, selling chocolate everywhere else is going to be easy, right? So the key, I would say, for Indian companies is to ask the question, where is Indian demand? Because of the characteristics of the market, where is it particularly demanding, particularly sophisticated, in a way that if you can serve that, you will be able to serve demand around the world who would have similar interests, but maybe not as kind of picky and demanding. And that's if you just ask the question, like, why does France export kind of wine and cheese and fashion? Why does the U.S. export guns and movies? Why do Canadians export kind of maple syrup and hockey sticks? It's the national passion. Why did Japanese cars become seen as the paragons of fit and finish in the American market? It's because the average Japanese car buyer spends 60 minutes inspecting their vehicle before taking possession of it. And the average American spends less than 1 minute inspecting their vehicle before taking possession of it. Who's got better fit and finish? Japanese auto manufacturers or American? Well, Japanese, because they're picky and demanding. So you'd be the expert on this, Ranjan. Where would Indian demand be really picky and demanding and at a high level?
So I've got an answer. I've got at least a conjecture, which is the education sector. And I've been really struck by the amount of private capital, global private capital, that's going into edtech in India today. Now, part of that is on the skills side, because obviously, the Indian skills, particularly in English, are of global quality, even if at much lower price. But my sense is on the demand side that demand for education, maybe particularly higher education and post-school education, that's a place where India could be a global leader. But the other observation I wanted to make, Ranjan, is that it's not like this hasn't happened. I'm a big admirer of the big Chinese tech companies, and not just Alibaba and Tencent, but Meituan, for example, I think is incredible. ByteDance, incredible companies. In some ways, they may not be better companies than the top American tech companies, but I think they're more ambitious. They're way more end-to-end than the American companies. I mean, the big Chinese tech companies literally do everything. So we have seen it. Now, what was the Chinese model? The Chinese model, obviously, this is the way development has always worked. It's the way it worked for Japan too. If we look at, when they became the global leader in steel, is you take the best technology from the rest of the world, you do it more efficiently than the place where the technology was invented, and then you tailor it a little bit to the domestic market. And lo and behold, you can become, that's a way to get globally good really quickly. And I think that was the playbook of Chinese tech. It probably needs to be updated a little bit where India is concerned, but it's not like we haven't seen this before. We have seen it before.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
and I hope, I mean, another feature that I think of it in the Chinese tech giants, although, yeah, like I've always hoped Alibaba beats Amazon, right? I hope for Amazon to die. And it's because they're so zero-sum game. It's like they want to kill everybody around them. Oh, here's a sector we can go into and kill all the players. Oh, we can get somebody to supply us, and then we'll figure out how to put to create a generic product, put that above them on the homepage and kill them. Alibaba, at least from my observations, believes in an ecosystem where it is, I think it's more empowering every player in the ecosystem to prosper. Of course, Alibaba prospers probably the most, but it's not a zero-sum game. It's a positive sum game. And I think in the modern world, I mean, again, back to the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic, I think if you're playing zero-sum games going forward, you're more likely to be called out than if you're playing what is kind of obviously and clearly and by design a positive sum game. And I think kind of Indian companies have got a chance to do that, to make it as big a positive sum game as possible.
So, when it comes to India, people have spoken about that some of the conditions in India are such that there are dimensions on which you need very high quality at low cost. And that is an element of sophistication of demand that, for instance, has been talked about quite a bit. But I just want to make a segue because, one of the things, Roger, you have talked about is designing systems for efficiency, which is what the machine model tells us to do, to designing systems for resilience. And this language of designing systems for resilience, post-COVID, we find a lot of companies are also talking about. I mean, it's as simple as saying, if I had 4 factories, each of them should make one product each, right? And make that product at the lowest cost. But if I know 2 of those factories are going to be shut down because they're in the wrong area, I would suddenly say, what do I need to do to have all my factories being able to, so I can manufacture all the products all the time? And how do I design that? And that's a trivial example. But what do you think, both at an economic level, as well as at a corporation level, designing systems for resilience as well as efficiency means? And maybe Roger, you can pick it up, and Jeff, you can weigh in.
Sure. No, I think it is going to be one of the big themes coming out of COVID, and it has a sort of a wide applicability, right? I think you don't have a resilient workforce, right? If, as in much of U.S. retail, people do not realize in U.S. retail, for many of the workers, they're told their schedule with less than a week of warning. So if you're a single mom working at some big retailer, you've got two kids, 2 under 6-year-old kids at home, you can be told with less than a week of warning that, oh, you're going to be working the 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift on next Tuesday. Well, then how do you get childcare for your kids at the last moment? That's not a resilient approach to your workers. You're just burning out your workers, making their lives miserable in order to have low wages, in order to have your kind of low cost kind of model, right? That's not resilient. That's not having a resilient workforce.
We talked about resilient systems, and you're talking about a resilient workforce, which, Roger, for me is a new angle. I haven't heard this talked about as much. The resilient supply chain is talked about a lot. Jeff, you've talked about the leader of tomorrow. And you've talked about leaders in terms of the need of humility, openness, and you've talked about the leader as explainer-in-chief. If we are going to create a resilient workforce, as Roger says, how do you think the leader of tomorrow needs to change?
Right. The old model of leadership, and I think Churchill is a perfect example, is what I would call the hero leader, who said implausible things and inspired people to trust him to do incredible things, right? That's why we revere Churchill. But I just don't think that is fit very well to a world where uncertainty is the overwhelming paradigm. I mean, how can you say, trust me, follow me, if you don't know the future? So instead of hero leaders, we probably need humble leaders. And then I think the other H, to keep the alliteration going, is we need human leaders, right? We need leaders who say, listen, I don't have all the answers. I'm going to need your help to get there. Let's puzzle through this together. You picked up on a concept like explainer-in-chief, which I think is, certainly for me feels really apposite, right? I mean, if I was to be critical of CEOs during globalization, it was that they didn't explain to the public how the global economy actually worked, which was this dense network of supply and distribution chains, which allowed somebody like Donald Trump to use the trade balance like since I'm speaking to a Canadian, I'll say like a hockey game score, right? Trump said exports are good, they create jobs, imports are bad, they steal jobs, therefore the trade balance is like your win-loss record. Okay, that's not the way the global economy ever worked, but corporate leaders didn't explain that to anybody. And so we could have this incredibly simplistic trade debate at the highest level of politics.
I'm just going to pick up on that and just pick up on something that Roger said earlier, where he was, without getting into specific companies, he was saying that this model of a company which wants to beat and kill. So if you look at it, whether it's a military model or a competitive model, we somehow have taught in many of our business schools and in our economies that winning or doing well means you have to beat somebody else. Do you think there is a case for relooking the economics that is taught fundamentally in our schools in the light of some of the arguments that?
No, I don't think we need to do that, because I mean, I think Roger used the right term a little while ago, which is win-win. I think the way to win economically, the way to win geopolitically, and the way to win personally is to identify win-wins and try to develop them. If you see the world in a zero-sum way, I think your life would just be pretty miserable, right? Everybody else is a threat. The only way you can win is if somebody else loses. And I just, I certainly think at both at all the way down to an individual level and all the way up to how we work as a global society, I think life is about identifying win-wins and then figuring out ways to get there. And I think that young people get that today. And back to evolution of companies. I mean, I'm optimistic because I think our students these days are more mission-driven, more purpose-oriented than prior generations, and they're going to hold their own leaders accountable. They don't want to have a job just to get a decent paycheck. They want to have a job in a company they believe in and work for leaders that they believe in. And I think that's a really positive source of change.
So I agree that students are more win-win, but I would want Roger to weigh in on this. Jeff, I'm doubtful whether we are successfully sending out prospective leaders with a win-win mindset. Too much of what we teach and too much of the way we run our schools is about competition. So Roger, would you like to just weigh in on that one?
Yeah. I mean, you've headed in the direction I was, which is I think this is a time where students are very much leading the business schools, right? So they are asking for something other than zero-sum game, competition, fundamental kind of economics. They're asking for something different, and the business school world is woefully inadequate. I mean, I cannot describe it in sufficiently negative terms. The amount of intellectual horsepower, research, right? Journal articles, whatever, going into win-win is fractional compared to demand. It's similar to design thinking. I mean, for what it's worth, the only people who are interested in design thinking in business education are students. Full stop. And the companies that recruit them. Last time I checked, there are 4 full-time tenure stream professors working in design thinking in America. 4. Now there may be more that I haven't figured out. Students care deeply about this. So I do think that we have a fundamental problem with theory development, and this is near and dear to my heart because when I went to take over as dean of the business school at University of Toronto, I said we're going to bring integrative thinking to that. I've created theory on that, how to do it, how to practice it, and the hardest thing I've attempted to do in my entire life was get one school with a dean who cared about it and the intellectual property necessary to actually want to teach that. And the minute I left as dean, they stopped doing it because it doesn't fit nicely into existing academic disciplines. So students want it, and same with design thinking. We did that at the Rotman School. We were one of the very leading places in that. Students loved it. Faculty, just hated it because it didn't fit in the existing disciplines. So I think we've hit, in my view, we hit peak MBA somewhere around 2000. And I gave this speech at the Academy of Management, the world's greatest nerd fest, in 2013 on the future of the MBA. And I think the MBA in 2000 or so is the same as General Motors in 1960. In a period of secular decline. And the reason is because the business education infrastructure cares more about itself than its customers or the world around it.
Okay, so on that provocative thought, we'll go to MBAs and convocation speeches. And Jeff, I read this wonderful conversation speech that you gave at Wharton. And we have around 10 minutes, Roger, on this conversation. Jeff, if I could just ask you, if you were to give a convocation speech today to a graduating batch of MBA students, and I know you'll have to do that pretty soon, what are the 2 or 3 things that you would like to say to them?
Really good question, but again, I have to go back to what Roger just said, because I think it's so important, and I don't want to sort of speak as a woe is me business school dean, but I do think, so 2 points that you made, Roger. One is that academics are a bit inward looking, not outward looking, and second, that therefore maybe somewhat independent, the MBA is in decline. I think both of those points are true, but I also, again, I hope I'm not naive about this. What I also see is incredible demand for business education in the world. And not only in the Western world, but in emerging markets too. And India is a perfect example of this. So we've got enormous demand. I hope we can get the supply side right, or get the supply side better, because the potential value add we have, going back to where you started, Roger, to empower more people to be knowledge workers, I still think that's the right way to go. And so we've got the opportunity. In terms of what a post-pandemic, how would a post-pandemic speech to graduates differ from a pre-pandemic? Again, I think the pandemic's just accelerating trends. So I would say 2 things, I think, to students today above all. On the one hand, go out there and do great things, because the opportunities in front of you are unprecedented. We continue to mint new opportunities, I think mostly because of technology. But the second side is the responsibility side. That would be my overall take on capitalism, that technology is creating more opportunity than ever before for people who can take advantage, like our graduates. But on the other hand, the responsibilities they have are greater than ever before. And we've talked a little bit about inside companies. What do workers want of leaders? But I think it's at the societal level as well. ESG is still a bit of a cliche. Who knows what it means? Who knows how we're going to operationalize it? But the fact that companies are genuinely now being held accountable for their carbon footprints and what they're doing for inequality in the world, that's a new development. And so, we always had this do well by doing good, do good by doing well. Which way does it go? All I would say to graduating students is, listen, make sure you think about all sides of the equation. Of course, you want to lead a good life, of course, but if you want your life to be fulfilling, going back to win-win, you want to be helping other people. And so try to identify opportunities that are also going to meet your obligations, responsibilities to broader society. And by the way, that's the only way that capitalism can be sustained, because if the inequalities in our world of outcome of opportunity continue to accelerate, that's when the system could break down. That's when revolution could happen. And I certainly don't want that, right? I mean, I'd like to have a responsible capitalism that expands the pie and gives opportunity to more people. That's not easy, but I think that's what we should tell all of our students to get out there and try to achieve in their own lives.
Fantastic, fantastic. And at least my MBA students will be listening to this, and I hope they put some of this into practice. I'm going to pick this up, and Roger, you will not remember this, but you handed over my PhD degree to me at the Carlson School in 2010. So if I were to ask you that you're addressing a group of graduating PhD students, they are future academics. They are going to train the MBA students of tomorrow. What would be your advice to the academics of the future?
Well, it would be to go back and read Aristotle. That would be number one. Aristotle is the father of science. 2,500 years ago, he created the rudiments of the scientific method, which, thanks to the Dark Ages and some circuitous paths, ended up with the scientific revolution 2,000 years later, where Bacon, Newton, Descartes, Galileo created what the world thinks of the scientific method, but Aristotle actually created it. He was trying to understand the cause or causes of the effects we see, and he showed that you could do that by experimenting, by collecting data and being able to determine the causes of given effects. And we've adopted that, and business has adopted that as the methodology. So currently, you PhD students were trained that the only good decision is a decision based on data, right? Data-based decisions, rigorous data-based decisions. You're a managerial floozy if you don't use the data to make your decisions, and you're taught the methodology for using data to make decisions in your statistics classes that you took as part of your PhD program, and that you will teach students, wherein you need to have a representative sample to be able to determine what is going on in the universe that you are studying, right? So you've learned all of that, and you're now teaching students that those decisions need to be made with data analytics, so they're rigorous. If you go back and read Aristotle, the father of science, the guy who invented the technique that we're telling students they must use, he issued a warning. He said that his method, which is captured in Analytica Posterior, the most important book in the history of science, that method is for the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are, right? So that would be this part of the world. If I let go of this pen, it will fall. If I let go of it 10 minutes ago, it will have fallen. 100 years ago, it would have fallen. It'll fall next week. 100 years from now, it'll fall in India. It'll fall in America. It'll fall everywhere. And he said, in that part of the world, use my scientific method. But there's another part of the world, which he termed as the part of the world where things can be other than they are. Let's use this as an example. In 1999, how many of these were there in the world? Smartphones. The answer is 0. The first smartphone was in 2000, the first BlackBerry. Now, how many of there are? 4.4 billion. That's the part of the world where things can be other than they are. And you know what he said in that part of the world? Do not use my method. He wasn't equivocal about it. He said, do not use my method. And there's a reason, a good reason for that, right? Where if you're in the part of the world where things can be other than they are, and all your data is from the past, right? At the time you conduct analysis, 100% of all data that you're using is automatically in the past. There is no data about the future. You are assuming that your sample is representative. That's a fundamental statistical error that you would have been taught in statistics 101, not your graduate PhD statistics course, statistics 101. And you will then make a fundamental error, and that's what Aristotle talked about. He said, do not use my method in that sphere of the world. Now, in the world of business, which are we mainly in? The part of the world where things cannot be other than they are, or the part of the world where things can be other than they are? It's both, right? But I would say overwhelmingly the part of the world where things can be other than they are, right? And what Aristotle said in that part of the world is, don't use my methodology. In that part of the world, you must imagine possibilities and choose the one for which the most compelling argument can be made, not for which we have the most compelling data, right? Because you have no data about possibilities that might happen. And he said, quite wonderfully, that the job of human beings in that part of the world is to be the cause of the effect that they want to see. So what would my message be to PhD students? You have been taught the wrong thing fundamentally. A fundamental logical analytical error. And you're going to perpetuate that by teaching students to utilize that error over and over and over again in their careers. So what I'd say to the PhD students is, you have to recognize that there's part of the world where things cannot be other than they are. There's part of the world where things can be other than they are. You need to make a distinction, and you need to use a methodology that's consistent with the part of the world in which you are operating. If not, we will continue to make the complete error that we make and MBA students go out into the world and make, right? Which is to utilize data from the past to make decisions, which will do nothing but attempt to perpetuate the past and make them closed-minded to creating the future. And the only way we're going to do what Jeff would like us to do, which I agree with 100% with everything he said about his message to MBA students, the only way we're going to do that is to be Aristotelian, is to imagine possibilities for making it a win-win world, for making it a more responsible world, and then choose the one for which the most compelling argument can be made, not the one for which we have the most data. That is what I would tell those PhD students. That's
brilliant. And I'm just so glad I asked both of you these questions. I have to have one last question, and I may eat into 5 minutes and then do a quick summary, which is that both of you, I mean, this has been a conversation with two great thinkers. Both of you have agreed on many things. You've disagreed on some points, but I think both of you are believers in democratic capitalism. Both of you have outlined some aspects of what is going wrong. If I were to ask each of you to give us one or two economies that you think are doing a better job of democratic capitalism than others, and what they're doing right, where do you think we might start to look for countries who are closer to getting this right?
Can I go first?
Yes, Jeff.
So I'm just going to, before we started recording, we were talking about, our own intellectual histories. And I was telling us a story that I had a hypothesis that helped me academically, from early in my PhD education. And that hypothesis was, the question was globalization going to kill the European welfare state? This was in the 1980s. And my hypothesis was that Northern Europe was going to do better than Southern Europe because Northern Europe actually believed in human capital and had the capacity to compete in global markets, export a lot, but do it from a high capital base, Germany, Scandinavia, etc. Then, of course, when my PhD thesis ended in 1990, Finland, I think, had an unemployment rate of 20%, and Sweden was doing very badly. But I was struck. The Economist last week ranked economies in COVID, who'd done best in COVID, and they had 5 or 6 reasonable dimensions, and 3 of the top 4 were the Scandinavian countries. And you know, for a long time in the Reagan-Thatcher era, the sort of neoliberal view said that those countries are dinosaurs, that you can't have egalitarianism of opportunity and outcome. You can't invest in average people. You can't have regulation of the market. But actually, Northern Europe has done incredibly well. And certainly, other than the weather, that's where I would want to live. Go to the other end of the spectrum, the United States. And I do think that there are 2 profound inequalities in the US that in the medium term make you worried about the future of the country. One inequality we've talked about is the economic one, but the second one is political inequality in the US, where one person, one vote is violated across the board in the American political system. So the country I'm most worried about is America, because I think we have more political inequality and more economic inequality than ever before. The place where I'd love to live, other than the cold weather and the darkness in winter, is in Northern Europe.
Okay, so Scandinavia is where Jeff is going. Roger, you want to build up on that? Or?
Well, I'm of probably a mainly similar opinion, and what I would argue just is that Scandinavia, the Scandinavian countries, and let's use Sweden as an example here, have got tax policy that is consistent with what they want to be as a country, right? So everybody thinks of Sweden as this unbelievably high tax place, right? Super high tax, and so you know that's so inefficient. It's just not true, right? So Sweden has got smart taxation, and the US has got stupid taxation. So Sweden and the other Scandinavian countries, Norway and Denmark, Finland are similar on this, but I'll just use Sweden as the exemplar, says, you know, we're going to make this a great place to live. So we're going to have a great social safety net, and we're going to have great healthcare, great social services, etc. And for that privilege, Jeff, who's now gonna go there, move there because you love it. You, Jeff, are going to pay very high personal taxes, right? Now, what we'd like Jeff to do is get a high-paying job so that we, the government, can collect a lot of personal taxes from him for living in this wonderful country. How are we going to do that? How are we going to make sure that there are as many high-paying jobs as possible? We are going to have among the world's lowest corporate income tax rates. So the marginal effective tax rate on an additional dollar of corporate income is among the lowest in Sweden, and way lower than the US, although the US has been starting to get less stupid about this. So they say to the companies, your job is to create high-paying jobs in the country. And Jeff, your job is to enjoy the country and pay us high personal taxes. Perfect. Like, it's a perfect strategy, right? You want Jeff to come live there, and you want him to have a fulfilling career, a high-paying career, and then contribute quite dramatically to the environment that actually caused Jeff to want to come there in the first place. The United States says we're going to have the greatest country in the world, and for that privilege, you're going to pay among the lowest taxes, personal taxes in the world for that privilege. And we're going to have corporations, until recently, pay, next to France, which is of course sort of a basket case as a country, next to France, the highest corporate tax rates in the world. So that your incentive is to make sure you create jobs everywhere but America, and we'll see how that works out. So I will say I agree with Jeff, and just add to the picture of why I think that mix is right. I think countries in this modern era are going to have to compete as the place you'd want to live, and the way you're going to do that is by charging people for the privilege of a wonderful economy. Now, the only thing that I would say is an interesting caveat is that in times of peace, right, it's totally okay to be small, right? Full stop. In times of peace, it's okay to be small. In times of war, it isn't. And so the tricky thing, right? The really tricky thing is if you're trying to design the strategy for a country, it is actually much easier to do what the Scandinavian countries do at populations in the 10 million and below kind of range, and actually quite homogenous countries. It's way, way, way harder to do that in the US, in Japan, and Germany, these gigantic countries and diverse countries. India, another perfect example. It is ethnically diverse, geographically diverse, culturally diverse. There is, in some sense, there's only barely in India. There's all these little parts of India. So for me, the thing that I always struggle with is how can you be big enough to defend yourself in times of conflict, which the world seems to always go into from time to time, yet have that sort of unified strategy that is a people-centric strategy, which I consider I spend a lot. I should use Denmark because I spent a whole lot of time working in Denmark. I love Denmark, but this sort of people-oriented economy. That is the trick for the 21st century.
So let me, Roger, that was just a fascinating note, because you've not only ended with an answer, but you've ended with a question that we could take one more conversation around just that question, right? The trade-off that you're talking about. But let me thank both of you. It's been fascinating. As somebody who has an opportunity to build a new world-class business school from scratch, there is so much that I take away just from this conversation. But a lot of takeaways, for Indian businesses, we're talking about deglobalization, but you're also talking about understanding where your specialized demand is. A whole new perspective on systems for resilience, where you're talking about the resilient workforce. The leader as explainer-in-chief. Jeff talks about the manager and the leader of tomorrow as somebody who understands win-win, who's not serving a single stakeholder, has a broader integrated view, and goes on to say that it is actually our students who are leading us in this direction. And then Roger says, go back and look at Aristotle and look at what Aristotle says about structured situations and unstructured situations. And finally, if I can quote Roger, and we'll conclude on this one, for all of us out there, be the cause of the effect that you want to see in the world. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute privilege to speak to both of you. Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. There is a lot that I myself have learned from this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Jeff, for being a partner in this.